For all you Black Lives Matter haters, and possibly for some others, this particular video is for you. The Department of Justice is basically acknowledging, without acknowledging, that there is racial bias in the various law enforcement agencies and police departments. They are now mandating that all law enforcement officers within the Department of Justice, together with all judicial officers, undergo biased training in order to recognize implicit bias and also to recognize overt bias. Black Lives Matter movement basically tried to shine a light on this particular subject, and it looks like they have been successful to this point. Now, if only we could get all police departments throughout the country to mandate this type of training, maybe, just perhaps, the interactions between law enforcement and people of color, and I'm addressing black people, but it happens with the Hispanic people and Asian people as well, maybe something good can come of this.
For more than a year, Black Lives Matter protesters have been calling for change within the justice system. And now, it finally looks like it's going to actually happen. The Justice Department announced earlier this week that 33,000 federal agents and prosecutors must undergo training to stop their bias from influencing law enforcement decisions. The department has come under fire for telling local police officers to create policies against bias while not having a plan of their own. In a memo to Justice Department employees, Deputy Attorney General Sally Yates says the program is supposed to identify implicit biases. She defines those as subtle, unconscious stereotypes nearly everyone makes about certain groups of people. Another portion of the memo says, quote, but implicit bias also presents unique challenges to effective law enforcement because it can alter where investigators and prosecutors look for evidence and how they analyze it without their awareness or ability to compensate. The Justice Department will use a guide created by the former director of the Police Executive Research Forum. The organization is a nonprofit that provides expertise on policing issues. Joining me now is Nicole Austin Hillary. She's the director and counsel for the Brennan Center for Justice at New York University's School of Law. And on the phone from New York City is Kristen Clarke. She is the president and CEO of the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights under the law. And also in the studio today is panel Dr. Greg Carr, the department chair of Afro-American Studies at Howard University. Carmen Berkeley is the civil, human, and women's rights director for AFL-CIO. And Ralph Chittims is the senior vice chairman for the DC Republican Party. Considering all of the major cases such as Michael Brown and Tamir Rice, which resulted in no charges being filed, as we all know, is this training too little, too late? I want to turn first to Nicole. What do you think?
I don't think it is ever too late to have training that is going to ensure that agents and lawyers who are working in the Department of Justice are more sensitive to and more aware of racial bias. We know the Harvard Law School has been working on the implicit assessment test for quite some time. Corporations have been using it, employment discrimination lawyers have been using it, so we know that it makes a difference. I'm just very glad that the Department of Justice finally sees that it is now time for them to start using this same kind of research and information to ensure that their officers and lawyers are better trained to be more sensitive to the issues of people from varying communities.
And Kristen, if I could turn to you, are you there?
I am.
Hi, I want to turn to you. I know that you are quite an authority on civil rights work, and I want to ask your opinion. Do you think that a system like this, where you have implicit biases, is the same thing as racial profile training? What's the distinction here?
That we distinguish implicit bias from outright racial animus. Implicit bias again refers to this unconscious bias, meaning that there are groups that draw stereotypes about racial groups, groups that draw stereotypes about African Americans. But that is to be kept distinct from outright racial animus that some police officers harbor towards racial groups. I think that what the justice has done here is a very important first step in helping to raise the standards of policing, raise the standards that are used by federal law enforcement agencies across our country, and they're helping to set a new benchmark for the vast numbers of police departments and sheriff's offices around the country. I mean, hopefully they will too follow the Justice Department's lead and institute implicit bias training for their officers. But we still got to work to purge the bad apples. We know that there are some cops like Daniel Pantaleo in New York City, involved in the death of Eric Garner, Darren Wilson, involved in the death of Michael Brown, Michael Slager, involved in the death of Walter Scott. There are bad apples out there who are driven by racial animus, and I think that is a separate problem that demands stronger medicine, that demands that the Justice Department bring suit and work to bring charges against officers who violate the civil rights of victims.
Dr. Carr, I want to ask you, when you hear statements like what Kristen Clarke is saying and what Nicole is talking about, do you find it odd that the Justice Department is just now instituting a policy that they had forced other local entities to do? Are they playing catch up, or are they really being leaders here?
No, I mean, I don't think it's odd. I mean, I think the ultimate solution, if there's going to be a solution in an experiment like we have here in the United States in plurality, is to hire more non-white folks and to have a mix of law enforcement officials that look like the country. I don't know that you can address implicit bias. I mean, you look at the work of Jennifer Eberhardt, and I appreciate what you said, because that really reminds me of the fact that, implicit bias training can only go so far. If you had a police force and law enforcement that looked like the rest of the country, I think that would probably go a lot farther than just...
Well, that's true if you didn't always have the color blue trumping other things. I mean, you do have black officers and Latino officers who are also involved in that sort of bias and that sort of prejudice. Carmen, what are your thoughts in terms of the training that's being initiated? Is this a good thing? And is Dr. Carr right? Do we just have to have people mirror the communities to solve the issue?
Well, actually, in the labor movement, we're having an implicit bias training on Friday, and we've actually been doing these trainings over the past year with different unions. Obviously, many law enforcement corrections officers are represented by unions, and so for us, it's a great first step because it allows for people to enter into the conversation, not necessarily around race or gender or even sexual identity, but around the biases that we all have. And even though for us as Black people, we want to be able to talk about the explicit bias, the racism, the not liking someone and shooting them, but if that's what brings people to the table, then great. I think for us in the labor movement, we also have goals that go along with it, and so as long as the Justice Department is also saying, we will train you, and then what is our goal to get to a place where people are not being shot on the street, that's the best way to implement implicit bias training.
Nicole, I want you to have the last word on this issue. Speaking of unions, do you think that officers are going to be, and prosecutors are going to be receptive to sort of training, or do they think they have a different role?
I think they will be receptive. I will tell you, several years ago, the Brennan Center did a report on racial disparities in federal prosecutions, where we brought together groups of former federal prosecutors to talk about how race impacted their work. And I will tell you that many of them talked even then about the fact that this kind of training would be very helpful. Now, certainly within any industry, there will be people who are reticent. We know this. But the fact that the department is saying, look, regardless of whether you're reticent or not, everyone has to take this, I think it's going to bring everyone to a point where they will learn some things about themselves. I like the point that you made about the fact that there is the color blue. That's why this is so important. We all have biases, as you mentioned. I remember the first time I took this test, I won't share what my outcome was, but I will say that I was quite surprised at what it showed. So I think that even with the reticence, even with some of the people within DOJ who may feel that they don't need this, I think at the end of the day, they're all going to find that they will benefit from this and the department will be better served as a result.
Well, let's hope so. Thank you, Kristen, and thank you, Nicole, for your thoughts on the panel.
All right, and the very first person that I nominate to take this course, this training, is Sheriff David Clarke. Sheriff David Clarke has self-hate issues. Anytime a person can compare the Ku Klux Klan, which has a history of lynching, killing, and otherwise just totally disrespecting black people and doing things that are unspeakable specifically to black people. Anytime a person can compare that racist hate group to the Black Lives Matter movement, which has not killed anybody, hung anybody, prevented any person from obtaining a job, basically just shined a light on issues. Anytime a person can make that comparison, he's got self-hate issues. So I suggest that, number one, he take this course, and number two, they develop a course where he could learn to have pride in himself, which he probably does, you know, overbearing person that he is, but also have pride in being black and pride in everything that it means to be black.